very much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. And yes, I will start with slides, partially because of the reason that I have a very bad handwriting, so you're not going to understand what I will write. So I'll do a mixture. But what I would like to talk about is what we are interested in general is how living systems compute. And when you think about computations in living systems, we usually think about the complexity of behavior that animals, including us, perform. And we live all in a world which is metastable, which is dynamic, and where surprising events, such as the snake jumping out of the bush to kill the mouse, happen. And in order for us and other animals to survive, we have evolved neuronal networks which are capable of having memory, integrating in multiple information signals from the environment, and we are capable of making prediction. We can make robust computation, but also this computation can adapt to changes in the environment. We are also capable of learning. And this is very necessary because it is paired with the features of the world in which we live. So if you take the other extreme, for example, if you have a world where everything is constant, then you don't need a memory nor learning. And also the other side, if your world is random, then again, memory and learning will be of no value. Long-term memory will not be possible. So these features of memory, learning, prediction, signal integration, and so on have only evolved because these are the requirements of the world in which we live in. But what is for us very interesting is that these computations and the world is very similar also on different scales of organization. And that is true also for single cells, being these are freely living single cell organisms or single cells in our body. So this is a neutrophil that chases a bacteria. In order for the neutrophil to catch the bacteria and clear our bodies from infection, it senses chemicals that are secreted by the bacteria. So this is how it tracks the bacteria in order to hunt it and to engulf it. But during this process, the other cells in the body also secrete different chemical signals. So the network in the cell needs to discriminate all these signals and needs to be able, which change over time and space, and needs to be able to identify the relevant signals in order to do its task. So this means that even on the one hand, we have very different levels of complexity. We have computations that happen with neuronal networks, and in cells, we have computations that happen only with protein or gene regulatory networks. We can still maybe have a common definition of what this natural or biological computation means across the scales. And this is that the network that performs the computation integrates multivariate sensory information or chemical information with memory in order to generate complex self-organized behavior. And memory here, I would like to stress that it is necessary for any system that integrates signals that change over time. So if you have no memory to relate one event with the previous one, then you're going to react to each signal independently. So that's why for any system that operates in a dynamic environment, memory is a necessary prerequisite in order to be able to operate in these environments. So that said, what are our frameworks of computation? I think the current, and I would approach this from a dynamical systems perspective. And even though this framework actually comes or has been developed to describe neuronal networks, it is also the framework we use in order to understand how biochemical networks operate. So you have a given network. The nodes can be proteins, genes, they can be neurons, and then we follow the dynamics or how the activity of these components evolves over time. So you write a set of ordinary differential equations, and based on the topology of this network, so your positive and negative feedbacks in the network, this determines the landscape of the system. So these landscapes, they are governed by the phase-space objects, the most simple being stable fixed points, which are the valleys in this landscape. And these valleys are separated by saddles or by unstable fixed points. So these are, of course, you have more complex dynamical objects, as we heard also yesterday from Greg. You have oscillations, you have chaotic attractors, but let's take this most simple description of dynamics of the system. So this type of description where the dynamics of the system is determined only by the topology of the underlying network, formally we call autonomous systems description, where all of the system states are intrinsic property of the system. So they are only determined by the topology of the network. And classically, again, Greg gave a very a great introduction yesterday. We are only interested in the long-term or asymptotic behavior of the system. So we try to find which are our attractors, and if it's a stable attractor, of course, the system will stay in this fixed point. So we try to discriminate our initial transient period, and we are only interested in the long-term asymptotic behavior. So how is computation defined in the system? Well, simply said, how we analyze this system or how we describe the computation is that we have a network. That network has a specific landscape with specific number of fixed points and so on, and then a signal only switches the system from one to the next state in the system. And although this has been implicitly used both by Turing in his paper on intelligent networks, by Hopfield and so on, it was formalized by Hirsch and Barth in '95, where they say that when the system evolves in time, each system passes through a sequence of attractor based on the signal, and then we associate one of these attractors with the output of the system, and this switching between attractors is what we call the computation of the system. So if I have a neuronal or a biochemical network, then my intrinsic network topology is going to determine the dynamics of the system, and then the signals just switch the system from one to another attractor, and this is how we understand computations. So the question is whether this attractor-based framework can explain processing of dynamic signals. Yes? Yes, yes. So and then the input is the initial condition? No, the input can be signal from outside. So your system sits somewhere in this landscape, and with a signal, you can push it over a barrier. Because I can put it up. Yes, yes. So these are the signals from outside. So we wanted to see whether this can explain processing of dynamic signals. So let's take as an example the most simple example that we can find of a dynamical system, and this is just a two-component network that has a double negative feedback. We know in general that if the nonlinearities in the system are high enough, then this system will be bistable just by the network topology. So these are example equations. In this case, they model protein interaction network using Michaelis-Menten kinetics, but you can have single neurons here. You can have anything as an x and y. So this network, depending on a bifurcation parameter, and here this bifurcation parameter, I took this gamma, and if I plot the value of x with respect to how gamma changes, you can see that there is a range of parameters for gamma where the system has two steady states. One is the low activity state, and one is the high activity state. And this stability, or when the system switches from the stable to the unstable, is determined by saddle node bifurcation. So saddle nodes are typical bifurcations that occur when a stable and unstable state collide. They have a zero eigenvalue bifurcations. And then in this green region, then the system will have two stable steady states. So if we would draw the landscape or the quasi-potential, we just have two wells in the system. But we also have here a parameter region, the blue and the white here, when the system is monostable. So on the right, the system has only the low activity state. On the right, the system has only high activity state. So what happens if we would put input to the system? Let's imagine that this input is a constant. So the amplitude of this input comes as a parameter. So if we have an input to the system, then what we could do is we can map out a two-parameter bifurcation diagram. So this tells us for each value of the input how many states the system has. So what is mapped out of green? So here, these 2 points here determine the two saddle node bifurcations. This line here is exactly determining the position of the bistable regime. In this region here, we have the high activity state. In this region here, we have the monostable low activity state. So if I, for example, put my, if I have a constant signal, and let's say it's low, 0.01, then what I will do is I will allow the system to move from the low to the high activity state. So I'm just allowing the system to cross the boundary. However, the interesting thing, at least to us, is to understand what will happen if we have a dynamic signal. So let's say we only give a pulse to the system when we activate the system, and then we remove the pulse. Because you can see here, for example, if we start from here, we give a pulse to the system, it's going to move into a different dynamical regime. We remove the pulse, it's going to drop here. Here, the behavior will be completely different. So this means that if we have now an input where the input changes over time, so if the input is dynamic, this means if, as I mentioned here, you can imagine if you go in this region or if you go in this region, you make several transitions through the landscape. This also means that this landscape will change over time. And this is very equivalent to the picture that Waddington put in his book in 1957, where he has this landscape with these strings that pull down the landscape. So these strings in this case would represent the signals, the dynamic signals from the environment, and they're continuously change this landscape. So both us and others have shown that when your inputs are dynamics, there are two things that can happen to your landscape. So either the topology of the landscape will change, meaning that the shape, size, and the position of your steady states can change, or the geometry of the landscape can change. That means that both the number and the stability of the steady states can change. So if this is a situation, calculating the steady states only for my autonomous system in an absence of the input does not help us understand how the system will behave when we have a dynamic input in the system. So this also means that we have to change our framework from autonomous system to a non-autonomous system where our signal is part of the system that we are studying. Yes?
So when you say number of steady states can change, does it mean you can have completely new...
You can have different number of steady states during the evolution of the system, yes.
Completely new attractors
can appear.
Never existed before.
Well, yes and no. I mean, so for a very simple system like this set of equation, I will show you. You can see all of the attractors already. You are just changing the number of the attractors as you give the input to the system. In a more complex system, yes, I think you can have also new attractors appearing that are not part of the system. But what I would like to bring this lecture to is that we think that for computations in living system, and especially when you deal with dynamic systems, actually the attractors are not the ones that matter for the computation, but rather the transient dynamics. But yes, this is completely correct. So just to maybe illustrate what I mean by changing of the topology and the geometry, then I will go through the to the example that we just looked at when we have the simple bistable system. So this is here my bifurcation parameter. This is the x. So we have, let me try to do this understandably. We have here, if the system would be parameterized here, then it's organized in the bistable regime. Let me do this as well. So these are my two saddle nodes here. So this means when I have no signal, the system is organized in the bistable regime. Here, the system will be organized in the monostable regime. This is also in the absence of input. So in this picture, that will be somewhere here. But we see if we are organized, for example, here, we are crossing the bistable regime. When we remove the signal, we are crossing back. So this is a reversible bistable regime. So let's see how the system behaves in the three regimes. So when we are in the bistable regime, we start from this landscape, right? The system is in the low stability steady state. When we give an input to the system will move to the high activity steady state, which means I'm moving to the high activity steady state. When I remove the system will fall back here. So it's going to go back, you restore your landscape, the system falls back into the bistable regime, but now it will be in the high activity steady state because this is this upper branch. So what this means, if I want to plot how my x evolves over time, this is my pulse that I give to the system. Then here, the system will activate. It's going to go to the high activity steady state. I remove the pulse. The system will drop to the bistable regime because I'm restoring the bistable landscape. But then the system will stay in a high activity steady state, which means that the system here has a form of a permanent memory. It's one pulse is sufficient to activate the system, so to push it into the high activity steady state. And because in the bistable system, also my high steady state is stable, when I remove the pulse, the system stays there. So the system has, it just needs one pulse to activate and the system will be fully active. So it means it has a permanent memory. So what does this mean for processing of time-varying signals? Would it matter or how the system will respond if I give subsequent pulses to the system? Can the system switch back? No. It's going to make, again, it's going to go from here to here and back. So in terms of the activation of the system, it doesn't matter whether you give one pulse or 10 pulses or 20 pulses, the system will always have the same behavior. So if you have a permanent memory that locks you in the memory of the first signal, which means the system is not capable of processing time-varying signals. Another important characteristics, especially for biochemical networks, is the dose response. That means how the system activates when we change the input strength. And for a bistable system, this is very typical that you have this switch-like activation, because what you're doing is you're in the low activity steady state, and with an input, you just switch to the high activity steady state. If I now remove the input, then the system will never switch off. It will stay in a high activity steady state. So it means the system is organized in an irreversible bistable system. It has a permanent memory, but this also means that the system cannot process time-varying signals. I hope this is clear. Yes, please.
There is noise.
Even if there is noise. Well, if your noise is strong enough, of course it can push you back. But if your jumps are not related to the signal, that does not help you with the computations. So let's look how the systems behaves in the monostable regime. In the monostable regime, as I'm increasing the input, the system still always has only one stable steady state. So what happens in the system is actually the system only, what the input does is only changing the topology because of my landscape, because I'm only shifting the position of my steady state. This means that if I'm giving, so I have one landscape, the landscape has only one well, and what I'm doing is I'm just moving this well with the input strength. So what this means for the response of the system is that the system, as I'm moving with my input amplitude, I'm just moving my steady state back and forth. That means then the system will activate, but then reset back with each input because it only has one steady state, so it's only following the input. So it means that the system has no memory. And also the system cannot process time-varying signals because it doesn't matter whether you give it 1 or 100, it's the same for the system. It's processing all these signals independently. In terms of how the system activates, it's only, as we said, it's only one steady state, and the position of this steady state only moves. So you get something like linear, or depending on the nonlinearities of the system, some activation, and this only shows how the steady state changes over time. So both the permanent memory and organization in the bistable and in a monostable regime, despite that they have different properties, they're not suitable for processing time-varying signals. So let's look in the case of the reversible bistable organization. So in this case, we start from, and as you see, I'm very bad with this because I cannot organize the board, but anyway, we start from the monostable. So we start from the landscape of the system has only one well. You're going through the bistable regime to the high activity steady state. So you start from here, the system stays here, and then it jumps to the high activity steady state. Now, if I'm removing the system, you make exactly the same transitions. So I remove the signal, the system first falls here, but as I decrease the signal amplitude, this landscape is gone, I only have this landscape, and the system completely reverts back. So in this case, it's not like in the irreversible bistable regime. I can reverse the system to the basal activity steady state, but how would my temporal profile look like? Will the system have any form of memory? So I'm going from here to here to here. I'm reverting the system. The system has no form of memory because you're just changing, as you change the landscape, the system immediately drops to the other landscape that is generated. So again, I have a system that has no memory. And if it has no memory, temporal memory, to be more precise, if I have no temporal memory, then I cannot process time-varying signals. However, in this case, the system does have a memory, and that is the memory in which in the amplitude of the signal that activates the system. that means so you're activating again in a switch-like manner because I'm changing my landscape from here to here. So I'm jumping from the low to the high activity steady state. But when I reverse, so this is the amplitude for which I have activated the system. This is the amplitude where I'm deactivating the system. So then the system will not switch off immediately, but it will switch off for the lower amplitude. So the system has a memory in the amplitude of the signal that activated, but it does not have a temporal memory. And if it does not have a temporal memory, then the system cannot process time-varying signals. So in all of these three rather or more classical scenarios that are usually looked at when we have a bistable system, we can see that from the requirements, what we need to process time-varying signals, none of these scenarios provides the necessary characteristic. But there is one more possibility for the system, and that is if the system would sit very close to the bifurcation, or what we call organization at criticality. So what does this mean for the system? You're sitting in a monostable regime. So the system starts with a single steady state, which is the basal activity steady state. However, because you are very close to the bifurcation, your landscape does not look like this, like it would be typical for a single steady state. But actually here, it has a rather flattish surface. In any case, in absence of a signal, the system is organized here. When I give an input of the system, it goes through the bistable regime to the high activity monostable regime. And now I remove my input. So the system goes back. It's going to go through this to this. But now the position of this is actually close to this range here. So the system is going to fall on this branch of the landscape. And this branch of the landscape is slightly tilted. So the system would move very slowly in this region. So it's going to stay for a transient period of time in a higher activity state, but then it's going to drop back. So it's going to revert to the basal activity steady state. So if you would look into the temporal profile, in this case, the system activates. When we remove, it's going to fall into this branch, which is a high activity steady state. It's going to stay for a transient period of time because it moves slowly, because this is rather flattish or slightly inclined, and then it will drop. So now my system has a temporal memory, which is not permanent. And if the memory is not permanent, that means that the system can be again activated and it's going to respond differently to time-varying signals. So what is important about this state here is that this state is not a steady state. This is something what in dynamical systems we call a go state, and it occurs only because we are losing the saddle node in this transition. But because the system is close to the bifurcation, the landscape is rather flat, and then the system falls into this surface. So this is not a steady state, and you cannot identify this state with a classical linear stability analysis. But as I will show you in several examples from our work, but also work of others, it seems that these transiently stable states are very typical for biological systems. And we argue that systems use this or similar ghost-like steady states for computations. So why is this steady state or metastable state important for computation? So if I have, for example, let's say a signal that looks like this. depending on the frequency of the signal, and then maybe have another signal that looks like this, and then another signal that looks like this. What happens when I give the input? I'm going from here to here to here. I remove it, I fall back. However, if another pulse comes when the system sits in the ghost, then you go again through your transitions. So the system doesn't switch off, but rather it's going to integrate these two pulses into a one response. Now, if no other signal comes, the system will reset. But if you have other pulses coming, then the system is going to properly respond. If my signals are close enough that I'm always pushing the system when it falls onto the ghost, then the system will integrate all of these signals, have the memory at the end, and then deactivate. So basically what this memory does, it allows the system to dwell somewhere in phase space and wait. So if there is another signal coming, that you're going to integrate that into your response, and then you fall back again, and so on. If no signal comes, the system will deactivate. If my signals are so far apart that no signal comes while the system is in the ghost state, then the system is going to respond independently to all of these inputs. So this means that a form of a metastable state, it allows the system, which the system only visits if it has been activated by a pulse, so by a time-varying signal. If you have a constant signal, this wouldn't matter, right? Because you're going to push the system here, your signal is constant, you keep the system there. It only matters if your signals change over time. This allows for the systems to integrate the signals depending on its frequency or on its temporal profile. Yes? That is the general idea, and I will show you in the research talk and a biological example where we think cells perform such type of computations. But just, yes, generally, it's going to allow the system to have differential response depending on the frequency of the signals. Yes?
In what sense are you saying it's integrating the signal? I mean, the system won't know whether there have been 4 pulses or 5 pulses or 6 pulses and so on, right?
That is true if you assume that the system that it's integrating is going to count the pulses. But if my temporal profile that said, this system actually can also, you can make a network that actually counts pulses with this type of dynamics, but that to the side, it's integrating the pulses in a sense that my response dynamics is dependent on the frequency of the signals. If I have signals like this, that are far apart, that my system always responds independently, then I'm not integrating any of the information I'm given. I'm responding to everything independently. But if my response depends on the frequency, so it's different, this is what I call that the system is integrating the signals from the environment. Yes?
But also just to follow up on this, my understanding was that maybe this already is counting in some sense, because if I assume
it
there
would.
are pulses, then just by looking at the profile and seeing how long
yes,
something
and if you know how long is your memory, yes, exactly. So I mean, in a strict definition, it's not going to be a counter like you would construct it if you would construct with artificial neural network. But yes, you can definitely use it as a system that counts pulses. And just to be complete, how the system activates, it's going to activate in a switch-like manner, but it's reversible, so it will switch back. And these switch-like activations are important, in particular when we think about biochemical networks, because it means that the system can also filter out noise. So you have a threshold-like activation, so you don't activate of any signal, but only when your amplitude of the input reaches a certain value, then the system will go into a full activation. So I hope this was this was clear. So I will come back to this non-autonomous systems description a little bit later. Just to summarize, if we think about processing of time-varying signals with attractor-based computation, so when the system would switch between attractors, and I would like to point that this would be actually equivalent whatever type of attractors the system has. Then if you have an irreversible bistable system, then you have a permanent memory. In reversible, bistable, and monostable, you have no memory. And for organization at criticality, you have a transient memory. The irreversible bistable, the reversible bistable, and the criticality have a memory of the signal amplitude, which indicates that the system can filter out noise and have activation only when the system, when you see the right amplitude of the signal on the outside. But when it comes to integrating dynamical signals or signals that change over time, only organization of the at criticality allows you this. So to us, this suggested that being close to a bifurcation is probably optimal in order to be able to compute or integrate dynamic signals. So what we did next, we tried, I mean, this yes?
Sorry, slightly like a broader question. So I've been thinking about this, but I'm not like familiar with this. I don't know this too much. So one way of thinking about one mechanism for kind of storing memories long term is that, let's say you get a sensory signal, it falls in some attractor, let's say, and now I have an external controller that kind of takes that and puts it in a different attractor. In some ways, that's kind of how we store memories in a computer. So we put it in another attractor, and now the original attractor is freed up, or set of attractors are freed up, but the one that you want to store is kind of stored in some different place. Yeah. And presumably this requires a relatively complicated system. But I was just wondering, I mean, like that wouldn't really need to kind of
fully agree. So that is an engineering-like approach. Yeah. The question is, of course, I mean, any theory is as valid if we can find some experimental validation of what systems do. We actually came to this because we studied how cells process time-varying signals, and there we identified that the system sits at criticality for receptor tyrosine kinases. In addition to that, there have been a series of papers in different systems, developmental system, epigenetic memory, where it has been found that systems sit close to criticality because you can have this time scale. So the time scale of the ghost is much longer than the time scale of the system. It's orders of magnitudes longer. So for example, for work from Ben Simmons in Cambridge, they found for epigenetic memory that you can store a memory over generations in a ghost. So whether one or the other is used, I think it's possible, of course, to use both. I just want to maybe also say, like in this, for example, the work on asymmetric Hopfield networks, right? Because there you also process time-varying signals, but actually if you look at the dynamics, what they do is they destroy the attractor to be able to move in the next one, and formally that will actually end up in this type of dynamics. But there are different ways, of course, how you can realize it. This is, I would say, slightly different than an engineered approach, how you would solve the problem, because all the features are inherent in the system if the system would sit close to a bifurcation. Then we can debate how plausible this is or not. I can name several biological examples where it has been also experimentally identified that this is the case, but yes.
Yeah, I guess like part of the question is also in the sense that if you go to really complex systems, like we scale up the system size and we have a lot more degrees of freedom, like do we kind of expect to see qualitatively different kind of
So what I can say is from what we do, we analyze larger that is biochemical networks of like 60 components and so on. But we also play with RNNs when we train them on different tasks. And then what we have developed and what I will show you next is an algorithm. I mean, because this is a simple example, right? I can find out where my ghost is, but how would you do this in a large network? So when we train RNNs, we try to look in the phase space to try to identify fixed points, limit cycles, ghosts, and so on. And what we find there is that again, this I draw on like 5, 6 different training examples we have done, that when your tasks involve working memory type of tasks, then the system in the phase space always generates a ghost-like structure. So it always stays away from all the fixed points, and it generates a ghost-like structure. If you train it like on a 3-bit flip-flop task, then it's completely different. You get your attractors, your saddles in between, and all is fine. So I think this type of dynamics is important when the system processes, it's some time-dependent or temporal memory-dependent task. But again, this is not a proof for that a living system would do this or the other. Yes? No? Okay. Then let me tell you a bit more about the ghosts. So we try to characterize, despite what I want to say is the ghosts, they're not new. So Strugatz has described them in laser system in 1989. It's a beautiful PRL paper where they identified this ghost type of structures. But the description has always been, of course, when the system sits close to a saddle node bifurcation, then the question for us came, okay, if we have a more complex network, how can we identify if a system uses this type of structures for computations? But in order to determine the properties of this type of phase-space structures, you can use a very simple normal form of a saddle node bifurcation. So when your alpha is smaller than 0, the system has one fixed point and one saddle, and in absence for alpha larger than 1, the system has no fixed points. However, if the system is very close to the saddle node bifurcation, as I said, so if it approaches alpha from the positive side, the system has this ghost-like set. And as I mentioned, that these ghost structures are formally or Lyapunov unstable, then we compare its features to a saddle because the saddle is also an unstable phase-space structures. So you can calculate also this quasi-potential landscape for these simple systems, and this ghost-like ghost set, it looks like a chair where your seat is slightly tilted. So you fall down on the chair, and then you slowly roll down along the seat, and you will fall out. So in order to be able to understand the characteristics of these ghost sets, you can construct a Lyapunov function which tells you about the stability of the system. And in a most simple case, this can be like a kinetic energy like function. And then you can minimize this function also numerically. So this is also kind of an algorithmic way how you can do it for large networks. So you can minimize it, and then for a saddle, this Q or this Lyapunov function will be 0 because the saddle is a fixed point. But when you minimize this Q, also when alpha is close to 0, you actually see that you have this large region in the phase space, whereas the kinetic energy is close to 0. So now, since Q is close to 0, system is almost linear, so you can linearize locally and calculate locally the eigenvalues. And if you take the highest eigenvalues, then for a saddle, the highest eigenvalue is positive, which tells us, as we know, that the saddle is an unstable phase-space object. But when we look how the eigenvalue looks in this region where Q is minimized around the ghost, we see that the eigenvalue changes from negative to positive, crossing to 0. So what this means is that what the ghosts do, which you can also see it from its geometry, is just arranging the flow to go into a one direction. And you're passing through eigenvalue of 0, which means that this is giving you the slow dynamics. So in a way, what the GOES do, they're just funneling the flow in the phase space and directing it. So if I would plot a trajectory on top of this, for the saddle, of course, we have this one stable manifold and unstable manifold. So if I start from here, I will be very quickly deflected in this direction. And then the ghost, if I have a ghost, then the trajectory will pass through the whole range. It will slow down and exit on the other side. So if you think as well about how the system will behave, I mean, saddles have been usually used in many examples, also in biology, as a phase-space object that can be used by the system to make decision, because you can count down on this side and then roll on the one or the other side. But this would work if the system has a long enough trapping time on the saddle. So what we did is, in order to understand how the both phase-space objects will behave and whether they're suitable for computations when there is a noise in the system, what we did is we calculate the total trapping time versus noise intensity. So when we change noise intensity. So the simple system, you can do it also analytically. So what you see is that a saddle is very unstable, because as you increase your noise intensity, your total trapping time exponentially decays, because you have two unstable directions. It's very easy for noise to kick you in one or the other direction, whereas a ghost phase-space object, it's relatively stable with respect to the noise, because even if you increase to relatively high noise intensity, your trapping time doesn't change, because you have only one direction to escape, which makes this phase-space object also rather stable with respect to noise. Yes? Yes, just white noise. Sorry, I didn't mention that. Okay, so then you can define this formally. And I'm going to mention this only for one reason. So we have defined this ghost attracting set as a close bounded set that does not contain any semi-trajectories in forward time. And there is a basin of attraction of the ghost sets that fulfills the classical features of how you would describe any phase-space objects of attractivity, contractility, and minimality. But I'm showing this only for one reason. So if I define my ghost object as an attracting set with a basin of attraction, then what you can do is you can define scaffolds of these objects. So you can kind of connect these ghosts in phase space. So then what the system will do is will get trapped in one of these ghosts, then it's going to fall on another one, fall on another one, and so on. Or you can, you can loop it around. So what you're going to get is like a cycle of ghosts when the system goes into one, falls on the other one, goes onto one. So you get something like a slow, fast dynamics, but it's not coming from attractors, but it's coming rather from these metastable objects. And in order to be able to actually also analytically find out such ghost-like structures, we worked with our collaborators, Alexander Gorban and Ivan Chukin, who also developed an extension on the Lyapunov stability analysis to be able to identify these objects analytically. Yes?
Are there simple examples where you see
yes.
these kind of things?
Yes, I will show you a few examples. We actually, I mean, once you know what you look for, you find them everywhere, because the channel is only aligned saddle node bifurcations. So if you're positioned here, you're going to fall from one to the other ghost. And a ghost cycle is just aligned sneak bifurcations. So you have them in any system. Yes?
And is there a way of thinking about it, not 1D or 2D, but in higher dimensions?
Ghosts in higher dimension. Yes, so.
Or are there these ghost channels?
So for the moment, we are trying to think only about ghosts in higher dimensions. So you can have a ghost plane where you arrange the flow in a specific way. And we have constructed like a normal form for such a system. We still cannot think in higher dimensions than that. But I mean, we are working on this, and also Peter Ashwin, he's a mathematician at the University of Exeter, so he's also thinking about very similarly, because we actually find this in coupled phase oscillators, like simple models that describe neuronal dynamics, and also in trained RNNs. So now we are trying to generalize a bit, but what I just want to say is that this is like a completely open field, and there is so much to do. So if anyone is interested, I really encourage you to join in, because it seems like also very interesting from a theoretical perspective. Yes.
So typically, the existence of these ghost basins of attraction and ghost channels, do they require fine-tuning of the parameters?
Yes. So
Like
this is,
right?
yes, this is the other point. So formally, yes, but there are ways how the system can self-organize to be close to the bifurcation by using feedback-based systems. So in our case, we have shown it experimentally for the biochemical network that the system sits close to the bifurcation, because we did genetic manipulation to put it in the bistable and to push it in the monostable. So let's say we are fairly certain that the system sits close to the bifurcation. We also do experiments where we deplete so for us, the bifurcation parameters is the receptors in the cell surface. If we deplete it, the system takes 6 to 8 hours to generate new receptors, and it's again positioned there. So I think it's clear that it has some kind of a self-organizing mechanism. We don't know what it is. However, there has been a set of papers from Ben Marta and Isabella Graf, and Ben is at Yale, Isabella is now in Heidelberg, where they proposed, so they work on the pit sensing organ in snakes, and they have identified a feedback type of mechanism, and it's a different bifurcation there. It's a hop bifurcation, but they proposed a feedback-like mechanism how the system can maintain itself close to the bifurcation. And then there is a work also from Thierry and Monet in Yale about olfaction in Drosophila, where they also showed that the system sits close to the bifurcation. The work I mentioned on gene regulatory networks. There are papers about developmental system in Marcantia. It's a flower where the system also seems to sit close to a saddle node bifurcation. I think it's harder to identify how the systems maintain themselves in. But I think, especially in our system, it's definitely some kind of a feedback mechanism that keeps the system there.
Could I ask a follow-up on that? So you've said it's stable to sort of state variable noise, but to parametric noise, if you're very close to a bifurcation, then you create traps and then you come back into sort of a smooth channel-like state. What does that do?
So that again follows to the same question. I mean, this is, of course, the system does not have a memory, temporal memory, only when you're exact to the bifurcation. It's a region. So the far you go to the further from the bifurcation, the memory exponentially decreases. So there is still a range in a parametric space. And again, we analyze the system with respect to one parameters, but actually it's a plane where the system can move. So right. The parameters it can. You can construct, I don't know of a real example, but you can easily construct such a system when the system spends different amounts of time in the different ghosts. Okay, it's 10:30, so I will really rush. What we suggest is that when you have time-varying signals, the system does not compute with attractors, but rather it uses transients that come from ghost sets or ghost-like sets. So we have shown that these are important for cells to maintain memory in order to be able to navigate in a changing environment. So if you disrupt the signal or you switch the signal from the other side, then because the receptor network has this ghost, it can, in the phosphorylation of the receptor, it can integrate these signals. What we are very excited about is whether this type of dynamics can give us mechanistic models of basic forms of learning. So we have, or hopefully the preprint will come out in a couple of months. We have shown that on a level of biochemical network, also theoretically and experimentally, you can have a basic form of non-associative learning. And as I already mentioned, we also work with RNNs, and then we analyze in the phase space, and then we find that different working memory tasks, the system uses such ghost-like sets. To come to one of the other questions, whether these are typical, well, the anterior-posterior patterning in metazoans and gene regulatory network generating broader multipotency. So these type of examples, they actually operate on the basis of ghost cycles. But we have also shown and identified that ghost channels, so something like this, is actually a possible explanation for a climate model of a cascade tipping when the system tips from one to another regime, but also in freshwater ecosystems where you have cyclical shifts between a clear water state and a turboid state. So these shifts from one to another state could be explained actually as switches between these transiently stable states. We think they're typical for a broad class of natural systems. And then maybe I'm going to leave this for the research talk afterwards. So thank you for your attention.